So let's begin. Let's get going. So yeah, with my photography, I'm always trying to think of what I can do to make things interesting. I live in North Texas, specifically Denton, Texas, which is a little bit outside of Dallas. And we have very little access to the ocean or the mountains or beautiful things that you might find in other parts of the world. So we have to get creative with how to create images that other people are going to like. And perspective is definitely one of the best ways you can do that. So with this particular image that we're looking at right here, this is an image of my son playing basketball or practicing. And what I did here is I shot this one with my iPhone. This is a few years ago, so this is maybe like an iPhone 8, I don't remember, with just directly on the ground, pointed straight up. And I would just have him, practice his layups or whatever he's doing here and take a shot pointed straight up. And so what that did was that allowed me to kind of isolate my subject against the background here. So he's just kind of really popping out against just the sky, which is just a cloudy day. So it's just kind of a blank sky. Whereas if I would have shot this pointed at him while standing, I'd have an ugly parking lot or a baseball field or a playground or something along those lines. But by pointing the camera straight up into the sky, we're getting a little bit of negative space and a much more simplified image there. But yeah, perspective, this is one way that you can use it. So we'll go on to the next slide here. And Maya, feel free to interrupt me if we or you have any questions. But yeah, here's another one. In this particular shot, this is a street corner in downtown Denton. And in this shot, I was just walking by, and one particular day in the morning, I noticed that the sun had cast this shadow from the stop sign against the wall. And that doesn't happen every day, and it definitely doesn't happen all the time during the day, but it did happen during this one particular time. And I managed to catch it when I was walking by because I was just ready and open for photographs. But if I would have zoomed out just a little bit or gotten just a little bit different of an angle, this picture would be much, much uglier, whether it's cars parked on the street or a trash can over there or signage from a nearby store would be, offsetting otherwise what I wanted us to see, which was kind of the staircase on the left and the shadow of the stop sign on the right, and kind of how they contrasted against one another. But kind of finding those little details, being open to them, and then kind of composing from the inside out, finding the cool shot, and then seeing how far you can go back until the shot kind of gets ruined, and then holding it right there. It looks like Maya has a question.
Yeah, so this is what I get really excited talking to you about because I always tell people I'm a creator as well. I'm an artist. Photography is new to me though. I think about art in a totally different way. Is this a skill that you have to like work up and really like flex and practice, or are you really good at just like walking down the street like this in this situation and really just being able to frame that shot correctly to know it's interesting enough to shoot?
That is such a good question, because I think you're totally right. I think this is a skill that you have to practice, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. And it's not just walking around kind of with an open eye looking for things. It's also like looking at other people's photos and kind of looking at them and seeing like, oh, this is the type of details that they're looking for. I like this. Maybe I should look for this type of thing in my everyday life, because this is something that, you're not going out there and setting something up. You're just being open and receptive to the world around you and trying to find things like this. So, you can definitely get your steps in walking around looking for something like this, because it doesn't always occur, but you might have to walk around and, peek behind a corner, but just once again, kind of kicks back to your perspective. It's what you're looking for and how you're looking for it. Because otherwise there's a lot of ugliness in the world, and you have to kind of look for how you can find certain details of the ugliness and kind of create, and compose an image from it.
Right. Okay. So that's really interesting. Someone mentioned too in the chat, it looks like a painting. And that's kind of how I feel like you approach painting sometimes, which is really interesting. So essentially just like being open to receive, being open to the possibility, but still having some type of a trained eye, right? What stands out in this image to me is the contrast between those different shades of blue.
Right, which I just happen to get lucky on that one from the building. But so like for me, I'm always kind of going out there and noticing shadows first. So if I see something like that, and then I kind of look at the area around it and see if it's something that I can kind of create an interesting image from. And so this one, I kind of noticed the shadow of the stop sign first, and then kind of looked over to the left, and the staircase was just right there. And it just kind of created that image for me. And then it's just a matter of, composing my shot. So I'm like I don't know, a weirdo about getting things lined up perfectly. So I kind of get all the little lines kind of going into the corners. And I think getting the staircase, going up to the corner was particularly difficult of this one. But yeah, that's where my brain goes.
Awesome. There's a few good questions that popped up, and just to remind everyone, we will have a portion at the end to go through everybody's questions, so bear with us. I'm going to try to be fast and speedy with Will here, keep the conversation going. But it looks like someone asked, what is your favorite time of day to shoot? And then someone else asked more about the angles, like how you find your right angles for these types of things.
Those are both good questions. I don't really have a favorite time of day to shoot. It kind of depends on what I'm looking at and where it happens to be in relation to the sun, because I shoot with a lot of hard natural light, like on a day with no clouds. And so this one is early in the morning, and the sun happened to be on that side of the building casting the shadow, whereas I wouldn't have been able to get this shot if the sun were in the evening on the other side of the building. But on the same token, if this were flipped, and this stop sign were on the other side of the building, I'd have to shoot it at night. So I don't really have a favorite time. I'm an early riser, so I guess I'd rather shoot in the morning rather than the evening. But aside from that, not really too worried about it. And then what was the other question about angles?
Whoever asked that question, if you want to ask again really fast in Menti, so I don't mess it up for you, but I believe they asked how, just like one more detail, like how I'm assuming they're really attracted to the way all of these angles are converging in this one piece, which I think you touched on a little bit. But I actually have another question. Going off of this time of day, would you say the same rules apply at night then, or do you have to approach this like differently at night, because the human eye naturally cannot see as many things at night?
I'm taking nights off, Maya. No, I mean, because a lot of these are with the like sunlight, like I need that hard direct light from the sun. I kind of can't do this at night. I can do this until like early evening or golden hour, and then it just ruins it for me because I can't get the hard light from the sun.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, golden hour. We just had a challenge on golden hour, by the way, everyone, so check that out on VSCO if you haven't already. It's really beautiful. Will, thank you for answering those questions. I'll hand it back over to you. We can keep it going. This is really awesome.
Oh yeah, I like these questions though. These are great. Yeah, we can go ahead and move on to the next slide though. Yeah, so we're still talking about perspective here, and once again we have another basketball picture here of my kid practicing on the same court, wearing a Brooklyn Nets hoodie, which he shouldn't be. But here we're kind of once again thinking about what we can do in an otherwise boring environment in order to create an interesting image. So this one we're out there on a day where it had been a little bit rainy, so there's some puddles on the ground. And on this shot, what I had done was I flipped my phone upside down, got it very close to the water on the ground, and found his reflection in the shot, and then got that, and then used VSCO to flip it around so he appeared right side up, but the actual image itself is upside down. And what that did is it allowed me to kind of not only capture him and frame him with the 3-point line on the basketball court, but I'm also using the texture of the court to kind of add a little bit more interest to the negative space at the top of the image, which would otherwise not necessarily be there. So we're kind of using that to kind of add a textural component to it while also framing him at the bottom, and just kind of create an interesting perspective. We can move on to the next one unless we have more questions.
Yeah, I actually have another question.
Yeah.
So I remember when I actually took my first photography class when I was in high school, and one of my first projects, I tried to do the same thing, and it was really difficult. I found it was not, and it was very similar. It wasn't on a basketball court. It was actually on a skate ramp, like a half pipe.
Yeah.
And it was wet, and I had the idea like, oh, I'm gonna get this effect. I'm gonna get the reflection of my friend skating and get a really good image. It just did not come out that well.
Well, I mean, what makes that really, you're probably using like an SLR or a mirrorless or DSLR camera. And focusing shots like these are much more difficult with that type of camera. I've shot this one like with an iPhone again, which I'm not always using, but for the ones we've talked about, that is what I shot with. And it's so much easier to just tap to focus, because otherwise your camera's going to struggle on what to focus with. It might want to focus on the water itself, but you're like, no, camera, I want to focus on the reflection there. And you might have to do that manually instead, which if you're photographing a moving subject, like I think you said a skateboarder, you got to know like where they're going to be, and focus on that area instead. So that with an iPhone is much easier though.
I wish I would have had that advice. But kind of touching on that, I'm just wondering, like, in cases like that where you do have kind of an ideal situation, like you said in the previous one, you're walking down the street. Okay, you found that shot that's really interesting. You were open to it. When there's the inevitable in front of you, like different obstacles, like people, maybe weather, different things, how can you always overcome that and still get the shot you need? Like, what are some tips? And I know this is like kind of a meta question, but what are some ways that you can be prepared for the inevitable when shooting outside like that?
That's a great question. I mean, it's a little bit of making the most of what you've got, of the cards that have been dealt to you. So this one, I'm like, hey, it's not always rainy. But what I can do when it is rainy is I can do something like this. I can't do my hard light and shadows, but I can, flip my phone around, use what is there in order to get that type of shot. Now, if you're getting paid to do something specific, you might want to like have some extra equipment with you to compensate for that, whether that's a little mini setup with, like for me, if I'm going to do something that needs hard light and I can't count to the sun, I'm going to use like speed light flashes and like a wireless setup in order to create the same type of look that I would otherwise get from the sun. But yeah, you can't always count on the weather, especially, here in Texas. So you got to be open to whatever you get, and making the most of it.
I feel like I'm learning a life lesson at the same time, where you're also telling me to just be open to what the universe throws at you. And that is very true. That's awesome. I feel like you can see that in your work, because it is so simple and impactful. You could see the flexibility that's happening there. You can see that you're very open to just what's already in front of you. Very interesting.
So like my date, when I'm like photographing for like professionally, I normally shoot food and architecture is what I get paid to shoot, which is not necessarily represented in what we're talking about here. But for food, I'm always packing lights and like soft boxes and all that stuff with me, so I can always make sure that I get exactly what I want. But for architecture, I have to wait until the weather is right, until I get the perfect clouds out there and it's like the right time of day. So I go out there ahead of time and scout my location and make sure that it looks exactly how I want it to look at the right time. So I know when to go there to get the shot the next time. So that kind of plays into what you're asking about, I think, too.
I love that. I don't know if everyone heard that. I think that's another good tip, even in a situation like the wall that we just saw. Like if you're in a situation where you can't get back to it, but you have access to it, scoping it out and then coming back when you have time sounds like a really easy thing to really make the most out of that situation, the environment. Awesome. Thank you so much, Will.
Yeah, of course. So I think we're good for the next slide. Okay, yeah. So we finished talking about perspective. We're talking a little bit about minimalism, which plays an important part in a lot of the photos that I take, which are the ones that I want to take, not like the food or architecture that we talked about. But for minimalism, it's kind of just getting down to the fewest ingredients you can use to make a good photo. Because I think when you're first starting out, you happen to think like, oh, I have to have so much going on in this particular image. I have to have an interesting foreground, an interesting subject, an interesting background, whether it's a cool person with a cool outfit in a cool location, doing a cool pose, but you don't necessarily need all of those things in order to make an image that you're happy with. Like in this particular image, this is just some clouds and some, street lights, and then the sky behind them. But once again, that is kind of being open, being receptive to the world around you, but noticing that you don't have to have all of these extra items around you in order to create an interesting image. It doesn't take all the other stuff. I think I've heard a chef talk before about how a true test of a good chef is what they can do with like one ingredient. If whatever they can make with that one thing. Somebody commented less is better, and I
Yeah.
not always, but in some cases I think you can. So it, you know, kind of deals with whatever you happen to have with you, but not thinking that you have to have all this stuff in order to create a good image, because you can still create photos that you're proud of with just a few couple of items. We'll talk more about that here in a little bit, I think.
Awesome. Awesome. Did you always have this minimalist perspective point of view, or did you have to kind of like embrace it over time and kind of like also flex that muscle essentially?
No, it was all Marie Kondo. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think when I first started out, no, I was like I was talking about, where I thought I had more maximalist approach. I had to have all of these things in my photograph. But the more, and I've done this for like a long time now. So 15, 20 years. And the longer I go, the more I realize that I don't have to have too many things. I think it's difficult to create an interesting image that doesn't have much going on, because you have to think more about your composition. You have to think more about your focal point, what it actually is, where you want to place it, because there's not much it can hide from. So the more skilled you are, I think the better your images can become with less actually happening in them.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I'm seeing people in the chat are responding, really amazing. Less is better. Yeah, sometimes I agree. In this case, less is really better. Does anyone have any other questions they want to bring up before we keep moving along? I feel like I'm hogging a lot of the questions. One thing I would like to know actually is, for someone who's maybe not familiar with this, or just getting into it, or maybe has a hard time editing down, do you have any tips? Like, for instance, I'm someone that loves adding a lot to stuff, and I've been exploring that in my practice too. And now with photography, I'm like, oh my goodness, I take a lot of just random things and it's hard to focus. You don't know where I'm trying to get your focus to, essentially. What do you have to take or to say or tell us about really easy ways to get to that minimalist lifestyle faster, essentially?
That's a good question. I think that we talk about that here in a little bit, but it's kind of like figuring out what your focal point is, right? Like, what are you actually photographing? And this one, I feel like my focal point is really that big cloud that's close, that's next to the street light that's closest to us. But once you figure out what your focal point is, you're like, okay, what's the fewest possible things that I can have around it? How can I fill the frame with what I want people to see and to notice? And what can I get away with? Or how few items can I get away with being in this actual image where it's still an interesting image for other people to look at?
That's a really good tip. I'd add on to that too. Another thing for everybody here that might be interesting to use. I don't know if everyone here has used the remove tool yet. I feel like that would be a easy way too, in case, because you could kind of play around with it too, maybe, and see, does this work? Does this not work? What happens when I take things in and out?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, by the way, this image is really like hardcore for how simple it is. I love it. Hope everyone else agrees.
Cool. I'm good for the next slide then. Let's see. In this one, we're talking about, yeah, what's your focal point, which is kind of what we just talked about, figuring out kind of what you're photographing and then trying to eliminate any other distractions. And whether that's with the remove tool or through your actual composition of the image itself, you're trying to emphasize people to look at your focal point, which here is my kid walking his then puppy. And this one, what I did is he's on a hill. And if I was on the hill with him, we'd see trees and a bunch of other stuff, but instead I went down to the bottom of the hill. So by tilting my camera up, the background or behind him is just a sky. And then with a few editing tricks, I can get that sky to appear just kind of white to gray, or that little black to white gradient that we've got in there. And I've eliminated any distractions, creating negative space, and then further emphasizing my focal point kind of from there.
This is a beautiful shot, by the way. Very beautiful. Yeah. I'm reading the chat. Some people want to see some more remove tool stuff. I'm going to take you up on that. Everyone's like, what's this remove tool? I'm going to ask you another question, actually, if you have time on this slide, Will.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just in general, I really love your style overall, and it's coming across in all of these photos. You're giving us a huge breadth of tips here, a lot of different beginner tips, but you have this super, super crisp, clear, distinctive style. Do you have any advice for some people that haven't discovered their own style yet? How can they get to discover their own unique perspective and point of view with their photography?
That's a good question again. Yeah, I feel like the best way to get better at that and like develop your own specific unique style is to get out there and take pictures. Do that and to look at other people's work and then to kind of like think critically about it. So you're ingesting other people's artistic creations, you're creating on your own, and you're just thinking and examining their work constantly. And I think there's having your own style is kind of based on a few different things. You want to figure out what your subject matter that you like to photograph is, shoot that more often, edit them in a similar way over and over, whether that's selecting a specific, filter or preset that you like and continuing using that same one, and then shooting them in a similar way, your composition of your photo. If you can do that kind of over and over again, similar subjects, edit them in a similar way, compose them in a similar way, you will eventually develop your own specific style. But before you can get there, you just have to keep taking photos and looking at other people's photos and kind of with a critical eye.
Yeah, I feel like we could do more sessions with you in the future where we just zero in on all of those specific things, like you said, like having that critical eye, really training that. Oh, great question. I'm going to actually point this out. Someone just asked, does the rule of thirds apply to your work?
I mean, sure. Yeah. Rule of thirds can apply to everybody's work. This is rule of thirds Z. The one before this, I broke the rule of thirds. I think I had that cloud that I said was the focal point in the exact center of the image. This image that we're looking at right now, if I'm being honest, it bothers me that he's closer to the right side of the frame because I want that. Normally, if you have somebody facing to the side, you want the negative space to be in front of them. So I wish he was on that rule of thirds intersection point to the left more than he is to the right, but that's nitpicking. But yeah, so I sometimes am thinking rule of thirds, but it's never something that I'm like, oh, this picture has to have the rule of thirds.
I was going to ask another question, but I'll hold it to not take up too much time. We keep it moving, but I'll probably ask you a question on that here in a second. Great question. Whoever asked that in the chat. Yeah. Lovely photo. Everyone loves it. It works because of the dog. Love it. Thank you so much, Will.
Yeah, of course. I think we're good for the next one. Oh yeah. So yeah, once again, we're thinking about composition. In this particular image, this is looking straight up with some interesting architecture. This is a spot nearby where I like the architecture there. So sometimes I just go around, walk around by myself and take pictures. And I'm using framing in this particular shot to kind of frame the cloud once again being my focal point. I guess that's a common thing in my work, which I was unaware of until we're going through this right now. But here we have it. So I'm composing it by framing the cloud within the part of the architecture there. But yeah, we're walking around looking up, and if we're thinking back to what we talked about earlier, which is perspective, this one I'm looking straight up, right? So I have an open eye to the world around me. I'm not just kind of walking around looking straight ahead. But if you are looking up, maybe you should be aware of your surroundings a little bit so you're not bumping into somebody or falling off something. But yeah, that's an aspect of minimalism as well, is figuring out compositional techniques. We talked about rule of thirds a minute ago. Framing we have right here, leading lines, other things like that become very useful whenever you're shooting with a few things like minimalism, because everything is much more evident in your image. Cool. And I think we're good for the next one. Okay, and then we're going to get into a little bit of how you can, I'm sorry, this is, like I said, I'm at school right now. This is my classroom, if you can hear that bell. So yeah, how you can kind of create a studio wherever you happen to go with minimal things. So I'm talking about hard light here. Hard light for me and for a lot of the images like this one we're looking at is from the sun. And so you get hard light from the sun when there's no clouds. So on a day when there's no clouds, the sun creates hard light. Hard light gives us shadows with these hard edges, those crisp edges all around the edge of them. Otherwise, if you have clouds, your shadows become much more soft, much more feathered around the edges. And sunlight is free. I mean, it might come at a cost of, UV rays to your skin, which, some of us experience more. But then we also have poster board right here as well, which is fairly inexpensive. And this shot was just a water balloon against a blue poster board and using the light of the sun in order to cast that shadow across the rest of the poster board. So yeah, you can get a piece of poster board for like 99 cents, $1.99 maybe in 2022 at your grocery store, get some fun colors and mess around with them, or use split toning to change the color of a white poster board to something else when you're editing.
We're going to get into a little editing in a few minutes here too, right?
Yeah, we will for
Awesome.
sure.
Okay, I'll save my questions. Just a reminder, everyone in the chat, you're asking amazing questions. If you add them to the Menti link as well, we approve them and save them for the end. We'll be able to go through all these questions. So please keep them coming. Thank you so much.
Cool. So I think we're good for the next slide then. We got a couple others. So yeah, everyday objects. So these are a few everyday objects. We got a half gallon of milk and then a little ketchup packet, or the new type of ketchup packets over there on the side. And once again, both of these are just on top of poster board, blue poster board on the left, yellow poster board with the image of the ketchup bottle. And you're trying to find everyday objects that you feel like are interesting or have an interesting form to them. And then using, I think I talked about this on the next slide, but I'm getting ahead of myself, using the hard light of the sun to kind of emphasize their form and show that off. And the one on the left, I kind of actually held up the poster board at the back to create that curved shadow kind of going up along the wall there. But this is just using the light of the sun. And sometimes you have to turn or orient your objects if you want your shadow to go a particular way. But the sun's stationary when you're moving, where I mean, I guess the sun is technically slowly moving throughout the day, but it's not so much as that you're noticing it in your photos. So you might have to arrange your objects in a particular way to make the most of that natural light. And you can get kind of fun shots like these. So, you can create interesting dynamic compositions using stuff that you might find in your house that you might otherwise kind of overlook. So whether that's objects like these, or you can go and I tried to do one yesterday as an example using a like my hot water kettle, but I couldn't get the sun to cooperate with me at that moment. But you can find things that have an interesting like look to them. I think Maya talked about having a fun Sailor Moon doll or action figure that you wanted to do something like this with too. But yeah, with just a poster board and the light of the sun, you can create some interesting compositions.
I'm going to put it to the test today. So hopefully you all will see a stellar image of Sailor Moon in the style of Will Milne. Oh, I actually have a quick question.
Yeah.
What's the most difficult thing you've had to shoot where you went into it where you're like, I can do this, and then when you were shooting it, you're like, this is actually a little bit more complex than I originally thought it would be?
I mean, the immediate thing comes to mind is like not this, because these things are easy because it's just me and like a ketchup packet, and ketchup packet doesn't argue with you. But I remember I got hired once to do a photo of a bank's board of directors at like a new location that they were going to break ground on. And so we went out there in like July in Texas in the middle of the afternoon, and it was like 110 degrees and like super sunny. And like normally I like using the hard light of the sun to create stuff like this, but when you're photographing people, you normally want that nice soft light for professional photography like that. And I thought that I could maybe overpower the light of the sun with my speed light that I had on me, and I couldn't. So I should have used something to either flag the light or get a scrim to diffuse. And now we're throwing out photography terms there, a scrim to diffuse the light, because it was like a group of 10 people, and it's just too many people to do that. And I was never happy with that particular image. Thank you for making me relive that, Maya, but that's okay, I guess.
Always here to bring up traumatic memories. That's really interesting to know. And someone mentioned too, when I said like we should have another session with you, and someone said yes please. You all, if you want to share with Will like what you're learning from here, and if you want to learn anything else, like please share it in the chat. I think we could talk about lighting for like another full hour probably.
This is fun. I'm definitely down to do it again. But I'm good for the next slide, which I forget what the next slide is. Oh yeah, here we go. So yeah, going back to kind of creating something from nothing. These are just like stuff that I had at home when I got bored and wanted to create an image. So this is like my 3-year-old's toys on the left, and then watermelon on the right. And, just trying to think of how you can arrange things in order to create an interesting composition there. Both of these are just using the natural light of the sun. Actually, it's kind of easier to do stuff like this when you're using the sunlight because you can see the shadows when you're actually arranging them. If you were doing this with the flash, you'd kind of have to either think about the angle of the flash versus your subject, and then take a picture to kind of look at it and compensate for it, and adjust from there. But with the natural light of the sun, you see everything immediately as you're placing and as you're adjusting them. So, but you can kind of create fun little patterns or arrangements with everyday objects that you might happen to have, just kind of by moving them around until you can get exactly what you want, kind of creating something from whatever you happen to have around.
These are so awesome. I actually think the image with the watermelon is really cool because when I first glanced at when I first saw it, I thought it was repetition and I thought it was like photoshopped. And then seeing the little differences and the realism behind it
Yeah.
is really, really pleasing to the eye. Yeah, lots
So
of fun.
this one's not, but if you open up Photoshop, like the newer version of Photoshop, there's an image that's like this, but it's like landscape and has like 20 watermelon slices. And that one is, but it's like the little splash screen for Photoshop right now. I think it still is.
That's awesome.
And then that one I added more watermelon slices, but this is straight out of camera with a little bit of VSCO editing.
Yes. Someone said, is Photoshop an integral part of your photography?
I mean, editing images definitely is. I would never give somebody an image straight out of camera. I'm not always necessarily using Photoshop. I'm using, various programs to edit images, and whatever I'm going for kind of depends on my end result and my whatever I happen to be photographing. But this particular image is just kind of, you can see the different version if you open up Photoshop, but this is the one without any photoshopping on it. Both of these are, and everything we've talked about is.
So awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking us through all of these amazing tips. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we are recording this. You all will get a recording emailed directly to you in case you missed anything, any of the wonderful tips Will's sharing. But I wanted to turn it over to Will to get into a demo. And I'm going to pull up my phone and demo along with Will. So if you all are available to experiment with us, go ahead and get your phones out and get ready to experiment.
All right.